If what I've made mention of in the past has been any indication by this point, it needs to be said that the way that Australian kids in the 90s were exposed to media such as cartoons and anime was a complete far cry from what those today, or even in the 2010s and late 2000s, were able to be exposed to it. While America had a bunch of different channels with their own kinds of differing media companies behind them, basically being the juggernauts dominating their attention from channel to channel with non-stop blocks throughout the days, Australia essentially only had a couple blocks during the mornings and one block on Saturday mornings for the regular fix of cartoons, and maybe if you're lucky, something on ABC in the afternoons, with the only main game in town being Argo's Cartoon Connection, a weekday morning cartoon blog hosted by a puppet named Argo, and was responsible for showing audiences who turned into Channel 7 of a morning before school the likes of Samurai Pizza Cats, Sonic the Hedgehog, Mega Man, and, oddly enough, Sailor Moon. Hell, you've probably seen clips of Argo's Cartoon Connection floating around the internet in the last few years. This is probably one of the ones you've seen.
What can you expect?
You look like one of Bill and Ben.
I like the flower pot.
You look like the
wee.
However, this was until the 17th of July 1995, where Network 10 would begin producing a weekday 2-hour-long block of programming as a competition to Argo, by targeting the same demographic and appealing to the older primary school kids the best way possible, with a cool 90s edge and lots of insanity aboard with it. This is the story of a weekday blog which would live in the heads of many a millennial and even a Gen Z's memories, as being the way that they were exposed to what many would consider as some of the best shows that built around our childhoods and even today are remembered as some of the great. Presented by a duo of Aussie teens who would grow up alongside us to be the kind of surrogate older brothers to us that would joke and kid around while also showing us some really rad bits of media that would be cherished forever, and how their legacy of just 10 years of programming is still remembered fondly on even nearly 30 years later. This is a look back at CheezTV. Now, as I just mentioned, Network 10 was mainly putting this together to appeal as a rival to the likes of Argo's Connect, which had been running unopposed for close to a decade when it was still known as simply Cartoon Connection, with Argo being the host for only half of its run. But in order to appeal to the young, hip youth of the mid-90s that desperately needs some youthful energy in their presenters, there was only one way that they were going to be able to pull that off successfully, and that was with some borderline adult teenagers. The duo in question, Jade, Gatt and Ryan Lappin, were no strangers to working on Australian television, however, as they had both previously worked on the likes of Home and Away for Channel 7 and the original Heartbreak High for Network 10 before working together on CheezTV. And for the time of airing, they were arguably the youngest presenters for such a show as well, with Jade just being a few months into being 17 at the time of its premiere, and Ryan only being 15 at the first episode of it recorded and aired on Network 10. This was arguably one of the bigger selling points to audiences tuning in as, in their minds, who was better to be the judge of what was hip and cool and the best for watching than those who were slightly older than them, but were still in the know about what media was cool and whatnot. So, on July 17th, 1995, following on from the iconic pre-show of Aerobics Oz Style, just as kids were tuning in at 7 a.m. to go to Argo's show, Jade and Ryan debuted on our screens, and the now famous intro would play for the first time.
Sneaking in right on time. Only one thing on our minds. Through the door to another reality. Any place, anywhere you wanna be.
Immediately, you could tell from the very first moment you laid eyes on this show that this was not your average wraparound show for cartoons and the like. The CheezTV set was a unique look for its time, with its multicolored aesthetic, with shelves lined up with figurines, plushies, and all sorts of references in the background being a mainstay for the first 3 years of its existence. Not only that, but the hosts would more often than not end up going through bits and bobs of jokes that would continuously be present throughout the decade-long run of CheezTV. The earliest example of which being their long-running feud with the Network 10 security guards, who, as seen in the intro to the show, were mostly unaware as to Jade and Ryan literally sneaking into the studio in order to do the show, with them constantly having to keep up an act of secrecy as they scrounged through the Network 10 studios in order to find something to air. This gave the early years a vibe of this being a guerrilla broadcast of Jade and Ryan sneaking in every weekday morning before their classes, to essentially give the viewing audience something to enjoy before they themselves have to go to school for the day. Which, props to them, is something that teenage me could not consider doing before going to school. The lines of the first few years of the show included the likes of Garfield and Friends, Technoman, Transformers G2, Cops, Dungeons & Dragons the Animated Series, Biker Mice from Mars, and the like. The lineup of this era of the show is very sparse for what it's worth, given the majority of the 1995 to 1998 run is considered lost media by fans of the show. But for what has been salvaged in the last 6 years, it shows that the earlier runs were very much a bare bones affair. But that did stop them from managing to make do with what they could in the long run, as they were one of the first bits of media in Australia which managed to advertise the Sony PlayStation on mainstream television, even running a competition giveaway for it. Hell, speaking of the giveaways, those would actually be a major thing for the show as well, as they would give away packs relating to shows that they aired, movies that were coming out in cinemas, especially big ones like the console packs a la the PlayStation. Hell, the way they presented themselves in general, aside from the aesthetics, made it clear that this was far and away from what came before it, as CheezTV was the first program in Australia to have its own website. Bearing in mind this is in the very early days of the internet. And if you know anything about Australian internet, it's that compared to the rest of the Western world, basically kind of behind in most aspects of it. But one of the most groundbreaking aspects of CheezTV was the introduction of Karen the Ding Interpreter, who provided sign language interpretation for those deaf or hard of hearing, who in reality was Dr. Karen O'Reilly, who still to this day is an interpreter for hard of hearing or deaf people for Auslan, and basically interpreted the boys' communication in real time. Which is an amazing thing, given that for children's television blocks at this time, CheezTV was basically an innovator in ensuring that those certain little bits of their programs that helped all kinds of viewers felt included made the program feel that much more special. And Karen herself would be more of a fixture as a person over time and not just as a little green screen section of the screen, as Karen would essentially become a third person over time, even having her own pregnancy be a thing of interest for the Cheezoids to be intrigued by in the later years. That being said, however, the first 2 years of the program would essentially be this more simplified version of it, but it would gradually become more and more vibrant and have its own sense of identity moving into the middling years of 1997, where they'd implement more segments that include more than just themselves or actors claiming to be security guards. Yes, 1997 is the first year where the show seemed more... I hesitate to say professional because let's face it, these two chuckleheads were never professional, but the quality of the show itself came off more like they weren't having to sneak in and go full guerrilla radio on the scene, even if the intro still showed that aspect of it. This year would also be the debut of the newer version of the CheezTV set, one of which would be iconic as the one many would recognize from the 1997 to 1999 era of the show. 1997 would also be the year the lineup would retire the last of the kinds of shows that have been mainstays of the program since the show's beginning in 1995. Garfield, Technoman, Biker Mice from Mars, and the like were replaced by Spider-Man the Animated Series, X-Men, and Wildcats. But even then, they weren't going to be the last big changes to the lineup in 1997. Citing declining viewership on the opposing side on Channel 7, Argo's Cartoon Connection would wrap up its 12-year run in the December of 1997, leaving a proverbial void in its wake that was replaced only by Sunrise, a morning news block which essentially left kids of a morning flocking over to Channel 10 in return. This, however, meant that as 1998 would begin, one of the biggest changes to the show's lineup would commence, one of which would shift the consensus of modern Australian culture around these two boys turning to men and their early morning antics. 1998 would be mostly your run-of-the-mill program by this point. Jade and Ryan's antics were becoming more and more of a mainstay on the show, even going out on location to some more major bits for the show, some of which were just wacky shenanigans, while others were... interesting, to say the least! More importantly, however, the overall vibe wasn't being kept down, even due to it being the literal only game in town by this point in time. 1998, however, would include some major changes to the program by the middle point of the year, as the lineup began to include shows such as Saban's Big Bad Beetleborgs, Men in Black the series, Rugrats, Rocket Power, TMNT, The Next Mutation, and a lot more throughout its block. However, the biggest change would come on the 28th of September 1998, when kids all over Australia were introduced to the world of Pokemon. Yeah, 1998 was the year that Pokemon became the next big thing, and the anime began airing in Australia, and for the next 7 years of its run, CheezTV would have this be airing 4 out of 5 days per week, which would be a blessing in disguise given that the US was a few weeks ahead of us here in Australia. With that being said, however, Pokemon wasn't the only big thing to come for Australian audiences, as the next year in 1999 would surpass all the likes of Sailor Moon getting salvaged from Argo's demise, alongside the debuts of the Tick, Digimon, and Cardcaptors. The latter especially is a very unique one to mention, as Cardcaptor's dub here in Australia was a lot different compared to the Nirvana dub in the US. As the episodes were shown in the original broadcast order, the original openings and endings were left intact and the dub was less cut for time or for censors. This dub, however, was exclusive to the Australian markets and therefore hasn't been released on home video in its entirety, bearing 4 volumes being released here in Australia between 2000 and 2001. Because of that, however, it's still considered lost media for the majority of its run, which is admittedly a bummer, as that dub was basically my first experience to Cardcaptor Sakura. There was, however, one more series that wouldn't debut until 2000 that would basically, for better or for worse, be the next big draw for CheezTV alongside Pokemon, Digimon, and Cardcaptors. And that was, of course, Dragon Ball Z. With a lineup like that for the 1999 to 2001 period, you couldn't help but realize this was a complete microcosm of 90s anime hitting the waves on a weekday basis, to the point that these are all to this day remembered fondly by those who watched it at the time as being some of the most well-loved series to this day. But this wasn't without some sacrifices on it, as Karen the Interpreter left the cast in November 2000. Reasons were unclear at the time and even now in relation as to how and why this had been done. But if I had to hazard a guess, Network 10 was only allowed to have her on for a contracted period of time, and that time frame probably expired. Aside from that, however, there's no real controversial period of CheezTV to really talk about until its end times. It kept feeling like the program could do no wrong, even when events like 9/11 ended up interrupting the program due to real life being too real to work with. Hell, it got so big to the point that CheezTV couldn't just be contained to weekdays, as they ended up producing a block on weekends as well, dubbed The Big Cheez, basically showing off shows that wouldn't be at home on the normal weekday time slots such as Godzilla and Jumanji, and had bits that focus on more sports than zany antics during the week. Well, that wouldn't last as long as the main series, only being on a Sunday schedule for a good year or two before being discontinued. The overall success of CheezTV would keep going on for a while, even with the loss of some key figures and the main duo becoming more and more older. The trade kept rolling on. However, the next few years leading into the end of the run of the program would be an interesting run not just in the lineup, but also the general vibe of the show in general. 2002 to 2005 is often seen as the period of the show where it began to lose a bit of the initial edge that was presented throughout its original 6 years. The first major changes came in 2002 with the introduction of a third host to the lineup, with one Lenka Kripak joining them at the tail end of 1999 as an occasional host, with her becoming a more prominent member of the cast from 2002 onwards, the opening titles and set being changed in 2003 to reflect said change, with this honestly being seen as one of the biggest downgrades visually for the show had its entire run. The opening visuals were more tame and centered around dated CGI graphics, and the set itself was a more tamer version of the first set that they had ever had, as it looked more and more like a conservative rumpus room than the set of a wraparound show for cartoons and anime. To go back to the Toonami comparison, this is effectively the Tom 4 from 2007 to 2008 version of Toonami that CheezTV had entered, and while it wasn't exactly as bad as that was, it wasn't exactly all that great as a concept to keep going with and showed the first real signs of there being a wane to the show. And while the lineup itself during this period of time wasn't exactly the worst, as mainstays such as the later seasons of Pokemon, Digimon, and the back half of Dragon Ball Z were certainly keepers, and they added in new blood with Zoids, Beyblade, TMNT 2003, Yu-Gi-Oh! Jackie Chan Adventures, as well as SpongeBob, Mega Man NT Warrior, and Winx Club. There were some ones that did feel a bit tacked on, such as Gadget and the Gadgetinis, Bud Ugly Martians, Action Man, Spider-Man Unlimited, and Duel Masters that felt like odd additions to the lineup during this period of time, despite their place in media working out well enough. Between all of that and a lot of fluff happening instead of the regular wraparound segments, such as having Wizard of Oz parody as one of the continued segments throughout one show, you'd be forgiven for assuming the show was on its deathbed, but it did keep a steady amount of viewership despite said issues. Not only that, but there was a lot of good to come from this period as well, as it was thanks to the boys that some people would be introduced to the concept of supernova for the first time in Australia, as the Flushing Convention ended up doing promo for one of the first conventions in 2003 on the show. That being said, despite decent ratings and having a fair amount of cultural relevance still, including a very high energy air drum of Power and the Passion by Ryan that's still remembered as an iconic moment to this day, the show was slowly losing steam and the boys were growing older. And so, in late 2004, it was decided by Network 10 to cease production of CheezTV, with the wraparound segments by the end of the year, as the boys would finish up their run as hosts with a final goodbye episode celebrating their near decade of debauchery that they had brought to network screens on December 31st, 2004. The capping point being a tearjerker of a music video set to Green Day's Good Riddance Time of Your Life, which was a staple of graduations in Australia in primary and high school. I would know, I went to a lot of them when this song would play at them. It was either that or Forever Young. To this day, that music video still gets me and a lot of people all teary-eyed, so I can imagine there was not a dry eye in the house of kids across Australia that morning knowing their surrogate big brothers had basically signed up for the last time, with the voice from the studio signing off one last time as well for good measure. The show would later go on without the hosts or the wraparound segments for several months in 2005, before being replaced entirely by Toasted TV in mid-2005, finally ending the run of CheezTV. That being said, however, they did say they were going to be around as more than just the Cheez Boys. So that begs the question, what did the team that worked on this do after CheezTV? Well, for Jade and Ryan themselves, information on what they did post-CheezTV is very slim to none. For example, I cannot find a goddamn thing that Jade Gatt worked on post-CheezTV, so he's a big fat liar right off the bat for saying that they'd be around. For Ryan, on the other hand, he ended up becoming famous for being in a Dare Iced coffee commercial more than anything.
You're fired! I love you. I made a sculpture of you. Hey, why don't we go grab a Dare iced coffee?
That is the face of a man who knows his best years are behind him. Okay, if Jade and Ryan ever see this, I want you to know right now that was a joke! No, but seriously, the one who was arguably the most active during the post-CheezTV period would have been Lenka, who ended up becoming a solo singer in the years following her time as the third host for the Cheez Boys. You may know her song The Show as being her biggest claim to fame. Heck, even Karen has been active online in the years following on. She even now has a page where she shares some of her gardening tips to people on YouTube and Instagram. You can find her on both under Kaz the Coda O'Reilly. But let's get to the main event of the post-CheezTV years, the many reunions of Jade and Ryan. The first time the two got back together was in 2011 for AvCon in Adelaide, where they made their first ever appearances together since that day in 2004 where they said goodbye to us all. And if the audience's reaction, as much as their enthusiasm on stage was any indication, they were well missed, and they missed us.
We'd like you all to give a very warm welcome to Ryan, Lappin and Jade. Hello. Yeah, it was all on. How you doing? It's wonderful to be here.
They ran multiple panels and guest starred at a few others during the weekend, and rumors began to surface of the two working together on future projects together. Some even beginning to wonder if a CheezTV revival would even be taking place. But, without explicitly telling people no, they more or less said that it wasn't happening anytime soon. And then in January 2016, this Facebook page appeared, stating that it was run by Jade and Ryan themselves, and it began re-uploading old episodes of the wraparound segments that the boys said that they had access to at the very same AvCon panel 5 years prior. And while it wasn't a full-blown CheezTV revival, it was the beginning of something new for the boys as they began not only running the official pages for CheezTV on Facebook and Instagram, but they began their own venture as a duo under the Jade and Ryan banner. They did a lot after this. They ran a Twitch version of CheezTV in 2016 and 2017, which ended far too soon. They did a podcast both on Twitch and YouTube between 2017 and 2018, and it gained a marginal level of success for revivals such as that. Hell, during the 2016-2017 period of this run, the boys went on a massive press and convention run for a good while, appearing on Channel 10 for the first time in a decade to promote their revival online, as well as do the convention circuit for a few years. They even did some smaller events at some special interest places. Hell, I even managed to attend one of said events and got to live a childhood dream of seeing the boys in person and have a picture of them both, despite how raggedy I looked back then. I even have this N64 controller that was signed by the boys as well, which I got from winning a karaoke or lip-syncing contest to either Rock the Dragon's opening for Dragon Ball Z or one of the original Pokemon themes. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it still astounds me that the ink on this one is still pretty good to this day, and I'm really glad for it because it's actually one of my favorite little bits and bobs I've collected over the years, and the fact that it's still there 6 years later is, it's quite amazing, to be honest. However, much like most revivals, it didn't last long, as in 2018, Jade and Ryan suddenly stopped posting on the CheezTV socials, and their podcast and YouTube channels were left unupdated until 2019, when they had announced that they had left their studio in Sydney for the last time. Since then, it's been radio silent on the part of the Cheez Boys. Ryan has stated that he may come back to Twitch in 2022, but nothing has come of it almost a year later, and nothing from Jade, period. Leaving everyone to believe that this may actually be it for Jade and Ryan some 5 years after their last bits of content were released. That being said, however, the socials for CheezTV are still active to this day, so there is a bit of hope for them to make a second round comeback. But I think even if they don't do it, they've done a pretty good run for a team which has pretty much been together for nearly 30 years by this point. And that's the major thing to consider as well. Jade and Ryan are very much adults with their own set of responsibilities by this point. I believe they're even parents themselves by now. They're not getting much older than us, the people who watch them are either. That's a little bit frightening, to be honest. So if they do make a comeback, that would be awesome in any capacity, because that last run showed that they had so much love for each other as they did the community that they made to give out. But if they don't, they had a bloody good run at that. And if by some slim chance that either of them watch this video down the track, for what it's worth, you boys have done a lot for people like me who grew up watching you in the mornings as much as you did for keeping the good vibes going into my 20s. Even if you boys have ridden off into the sunset, you've done a really good job, and nobody can take that away from you. But if you do end up coming back, what are the chances you could finally release that best of DVD you were talking about 12 years ago? Come on, you'd make a fortune off of people's nostalgia with that. Come on, I know you wanna do that, come on.